To that end, a lot going on this table, so I'll try to summarize for you. Across the top, you see conventional forms of power development, large-scale forms of wind development in the middle, and community wind off to the right. And then coming down the side, the various aspects of wind farm development that can serve to make or break a project. I think in almost all instances, land and siting are a factor. In wind in general, it is a much more broad footprint that projects tend to have. But in community wind, which are typically smaller projects, that footprint is reduced. Environmental and NIMBY issues, much better and much easier to manage in large-scale wind than in conventional power, but still even easier when you have local community members who are owners in the project and your co-development partners working to manage any local opposition that can come up. With respect to transmission, we've talked at length about the transmission issues that large-scale projects face. Often for smaller projects that sort of seamlessly plug into communities, there's less tie-in expense. And in terms of offtake, it is, on the one hand, more difficult for community wind projects to compete in large-scale RFPs to a small extent because of the economies of scale that some of these larger projects can bring. And I will also remind folks that some of those economies of scale relate to the fact that larger scale developers locked up their turbines at prices that date back several years. But with that said, community wind projects are often much better suited for rural utilities, municipalities, and cooperatives. I think in construction, the differences are less significant. In overall complexity, I think we would say that certainly project development is always a complex process, but perhaps when you have a local partner who's co-developing with you and a community that's on board with the project, you find that projects come together more smoothly. Which is a perfect segue to talk about how great community wind is. It is rising in the United States. The beauties of community wind are that ownership is retained in the community. A member of the community or a series of members in the community have some amount of control over how the development process is run, how construction is run, how these projects are operated, and that they typically stand to make a greater financial return than they would have had they simply been lease takers in a project. And so they tend to recycle those additional profits that they make back into the community. That creates incremental jobs, incremental wages, business income, and tax revenue over the more absentee projects. Community members are more likely to support locally owned projects, and you're increasingly seeing a bit of a backlash against some of the landmen who tend to come into a community and can sometimes run roughshod over that community in trying to lock up land for the larger scale projects. Community wind projects can use existing grid infrastructure and don't rely on new transmission to be built, at least not to the same extent. And distributed community wind projects can often reach shovel-ready sooner than some of the larger scale projects. In fact, a lot of the projects that are in the pipelines of the larger scale developers now depend completely on new transmission lines to be built. Some of those lines may take until 2015 or beyond until they're actually online. I think another important factor about community wind is that utilities who are going to buy the power from the projects or sometimes invest in the projects directly, they often favor this local generation over remote imported power. By involving community members in a more meaningful way in the project, it increases and broadens the overall knowledge, perception, and acceptance of wind across the United States. This model, as I mentioned earlier, is established in Europe. It's growing in the United States. And in fact, a number of U.S. states have community wind-specific legislation on the books today. One of the most exciting things that we've seen as members of the steering committee for AWEA's wind working group is that AWEA have decided to allocate a significant amount of its budget to community wind, including sponsoring for the first time a community wind conference out in Detroit in November, which I hope you'll all attend. So why should you get excited about community wind? Well, there's a growing body of research that suggests community wind benefits local economies in much in a very meaningful way, even over and above the already terrific benefits that traditional wind can bring to a community. For example, there's a University of Minnesota study that suggests as much as 5 times the economic impact on the local region can come from a community wind project. In a National Renewable Energy Lab study, whether it's construction jobs or operations jobs, often a community wind project is thought to have 1.1 to 2.8 times the impact on jobs in the community. And on a per megawatt basis, the impact of power sales under community wind can be as much as 16% higher than absentee projects, according to Eco Northwest. So for this group in particular, when you think about developing nations and which model of wind development they ought to apply, just think about the incremental local economic and local jobs benefits that pursuing more of this European-styled community wind model can potentially bring. Just very quickly on our company, as I mentioned, we're a New York City-based developer of community wind projects. One of the things that we think is most exciting about community wind is that it connects individuals with renewable power. That's something that in the traditional industrialized model of power development we've never really seen before. But if you're going to build a wind farm on someone's property, you need to spend a lot of time with the owner of that property, and in our case, make him your partner. We think community wind de-risks and simplifies the development process, and our investors think that too. It benefits from specific legislation that I mentioned, and oftentimes we're finding existing pockets of transmission capacity to plug into and are less dependent on the large-scale new transmission investment. We think of ourselves as a values-driven organization, and we focus on teamwork. We're building a sustainable business right here in New York City. Integrity is central to our model and our message, and we all bring an entrepreneurial drive and a lot of passion to our work in everything that we do. As a company, we've successfully developed and monetized a 51 megawatt project, also in the great state of Texas, and that created a wonderful return for our local partner and for ourselves. Perhaps more importantly, going to the barbecue next week of the community members who are all going to celebrate the project, and these are people who are pleased with the way this project has come together and what it's doing for the community. And we have 20 plus other projects in development across 14 U.S. states, so this is a business that is growing by leaps and bounds.